Enquanto você curte um som, a ClearSale cuida da segurança antifraude de mais de 100 mil empresas em todo o mundo. Só falta a sua. Fale com os nossos especialistas e fique um passo à frente das fraudes e riscos de crédito. Encontre soluções flexíveis que se adaptam às necessidades da sua empresa e garanta múltiplas camadas de proteção em cada transação. ClearSale, one step ahead.
Today on CityCast Boise. Human trafficking has become a hot-button issue throughout the country, but a bombshell investigation revealed that a local safe house was allegedly committing Medicaid fraud while not providing the services that survivors needed. Wilson Crescione, reporter with Investigate West, explains who was benefiting financially and why survivors said that being at the safe house felt like being trafficked all over again. A quick warning, this episode discusses topics that could be upsetting. It's Monday, July 29th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Wilson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
There is so much information in this three-part series. So could you very briefly explain what you found and what you wrote about?
Sure. So we wrote about, it was myself and a co-reporter, Kelsey Turner at Investigate West. We wrote about a nonprofit in Idaho called Community Outreach Behavioral Services, or COBS, that's become pretty influential in Idaho's anti-human trafficking response in recent years, in part because they operate safe houses for trafficking survivors. But when we talked to some of those survivors, they said that they felt exploited and trafficked all over again because of, manipulation tactics, control tactics that mirrored what their traffickers used. And not only that, but as we started digging in the last few months, we found records indicating possible Medicaid fraud.
Oh, wow.
Bogus Medicaid charges, things like that. And all of this happened because both in Idaho and around the country, there's very little oversight or scrutiny of these kind of programs or safe houses. Courts in the Boise area in Idaho would send victims of trafficking to a COB safe house without having really any idea what was happening inside.
They don't need any licensing. There's no maybe regulations or requirements for these safe houses or for these organizations?
Really, the only kind of accountability that they have is because they get some federal grant funding that's directed towards the program through the city of Nampa's Nampa Family Justice Center is one, and then the state agency that is meant for victim assistance programs. But, those aren't regulatory agencies necessarily. The only power that they would have is to pull funding. And we did find one of our stories was, there were red flags that even they saw and, either missed or, didn't really investigate thoroughly to really find out if victims were being harmed by this program.
I definitely want to focus on these allegations of fraud because that was a large part of the writing. What are some examples of things that the Community Outreach Behavioral Services, or COBS program, was doing that are allegedly fraudulent?
So there are two main ways that what they were doing was potentially fraudulent. The first just has to do with the relationship between COBS and the for-profit Advanced Clinical Trauma Services, which is owned by Paula Barthelmess's son, Tyler Bell. And Paula also, she's a licensed social worker, and so she would bill Medicaid through Advanced Clinical Trauma Services. If Paula had power to, as a clinician at ACTS, to keep residents in the safe house where, they might get money for each night that a resident stays there, that could be potentially Medicaid fraud. But the other way is just that residents said that they were being billed for services that they hadn't received. ACTS was charging residents and billing under their Medicaid insurance, sometimes just for carpooling residents around. And so that's another way that the attorneys I spoke to and the experts I spoke to said that that would be Medicaid fraud.
And amidst all of these allegations of fraud, conflict of interest, Medicaid fraud, you also wrote how the leader or founder of COBS, Paula Barthelmess, owns a $1.5 million property. She goes on tropical vacation. She was looking to buy property in Costa Rica. but she hasn't filed the annual reports to the IRS that are required for nonprofits since 2017. That seems unusual.
It is unusual. So they lost their tax exempt status in 2021, I think for about a year and a half, but they were still holding fundraising events during that time where people would donate to the nonprofit despite them having lost their tax exempt status. And they did have it restored. We weren't able to figure out exactly why that was restored, but we still haven't seen any tax filings from them. We asked Paula directly. We never saw anything. So it is a little bit of a mystery how much money Cobb's is bringing in through donations.
I want to switch gears a little bit and discuss the anti-trafficking strategies that Cobb's and the local police and judicial system are utilizing that victims in your articles were saying are actually re-victimizing them. So what are these strategies and how does it actually play out for trafficking victims?
Sure. So when the story says, the victims felt like they were trafficked again by the safe house, to be clear, we did not find that Cobb's was sex trafficking any of these victims. But what that meant and what survivors meant was that they felt controlled and manipulated in a similar way. And one way was how they were recruited or brought there in the first place. And that was through the criminal justice system. So one survivor that we spoke to, Allie, said that her trafficker had found her looking up her photos and jail records. And that's how he identified her. Cobb's also uses the criminal justice system to find residents. A lot of the women that we spoke to said they were in jail and would have a visit from Paula. Then she would offer, I can get you out of jail into a safe house if you give information on your trafficker, something like that. And that, to some of the survivors, also felt similar because it was someone offering them something that they felt like they couldn't refuse or that would help lift them out of a certain situation. So they felt kind of indebted to them, felt like they owed them something, and then would kind of do whatever they wanted. And in this case, what Cobb's wanted them to do was, represent them at events and fundraisers, and then they would get donations. Sometimes there were kind of odd things where they would go to like a local farm and felt like they were doing work without getting paid. And, back at the safe house, they had everything controlled for them. Their food, they had no connection with society. Their phone was taken away. Their transportation was taken away. If they wanted to go somewhere, they had to, ask permission, or if they went somewhere without permission, they would be reprimanded, according to the survivors that we spoke to. And so it was that combination of feeling like their whole life is controlled and then feeling like they had to do things for the person that was controlling them that made them feel like they were being trafficked.
Yeah, you also wrote about how Barthelmess, according to survivors, would look at their therapy records or the notes that they were taken during therapy and then allegedly use those to manipulate them or to coerce them into staying or mentioning that they could be punished more.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is a huge piece of this too. And all of the survivors and former employees that we spoke to said that that was the case and that they would either be worried about speaking freely to their therapist because they knew that Paula Barthelmess was paying attention to their notes, or, a couple of them said that they felt like what they said in therapy was brought up in group sessions or something like that as a way to kind of make them fall in line.
One of the quotes that you mentioned in one of the articles that just blew me away was that Barthelmess allegedly told a survivor, "You're going to feel like you're trafficked," but that's not the case. Wow. That is really telling that even she would acknowledge that the patterns were similar.
Right. Yeah. That quote, that was shocking to us too when we heard it. And, there is some debate around with these trafficking safe houses over like how much what kind of restrictions should be imposed in order to keep victims safe. Like there are safe houses that say like, yeah, we do need to take their cell phones away because we don't want them communicating with the trafficker. And we do need to have really strict conditions because we don't want anything bad to happen. But what, the former employees and survivors say is like, they crossed the line because of things like, inconsistent rules. Like there were some women who we heard were, they would use drugs in the house, they were supposed to all be sober or, violate the rules in some ways. And there was no punishment, but then others would be punished for simply kind of defying the Cobb staff or something like that. And also, that there wasn't an on-site supervisor at the house at all times. So it wasn't, actually as safe as it was made out to be. So on the one hand, some of these restrictions are normal. And then on the other, there were things that felt abnormal and that really felt like it was crossing a line. And so, Allie, the survivor who said that Paula told her that, I think initially it was like, okay, I believe you. Like, this isn't me being trafficked again. But then after a few weeks, she started to really, reconsider and feel like she was being controlled in a way that wasn't okay.
Yeah, I thought it was very telling that in one of the editions of the story, one of the survivors said, "They didn't do shit but make me more scared and make me do everything out of fear. I've been saved because I saved myself," end quote. That's pretty profound.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to something else that, the other employees were telling us was that, the clients that they worked through when they were working at Cobb's, they didn't feel like any of them had their situation improved after staying at the safe house. And in some cases, it got worse. And so, one employee said that one of her clients, was kicked out of the safe house and for a reason that, she didn't agree with. And then was forced to return to a trafficking situation just to put a roof over her head. And so, there are these really awful examples. Frankie, the woman that's featured in First Story, she was just about to finish her probation. And then she said that Paula kicked her out for retaliation for speaking out against the program days or weeks before her probation was supposed to be finished. And now she has another 2 years of probation and she just wants to get out of Idaho away from her traffickers. And she's unable to do that right now.
So it really seems like the strategy is to criminalize victims in the hopes that it leads to traffickers being arrested. And that did lead to a spike in trafficking victims being arrested, particularly by the Nampa Police Department. But was there also an increase in the traffickers being arrested and charged with trafficking?
There was not an increase in traffickers charged with trafficking. As far as we know, there hasn't been any convictions under Idaho's trafficking statute. So Idaho's approach, like I said, is an aggressive approach that, a lot of times relies on bringing the victims in and asking them questions and sometimes putting them in jail. But from what we found, it can't say it has really led to an increase in traffickers being held accountable.
Wilson, were there any bombshells or just really interesting stories or data that you found that just didn't make it into the series?
One thing I would say is, the actual trafficking experiences of the women that we talked to wasn't a major part of this series. But when we spoke to them, it was really difficult to hear. And it was an eye-opener for us just how often this actually is happening and how it can, how it's affecting people. And I just can't emphasize enough how brave they were for coming forward and sharing, this experience with us and trusting to tell their story. They still live in fear of their traffickers finding out where they are. That is a piece of it that, as reporters, that really affected us as we were doing the story.
I can only imagine. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about this really heavy topic and break it down.
Of course. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you found this episode meaningful, please leave us a review. It helps other people find us. We'll be back tomorrow morning with an expert's guide to the best local hiking spots. You won't want to miss it.